us a little bit more in the topic and will contextualize what we've seen with this intense documentation. We will learn a little bit more about that. That's not the only thing which happened with cultural appropriation and other things. We learn a little bit about the 80s and 90s. But for sure, we want to open up for question and answers after, we don't know how long, but at a special moment. And let me introduce shortly our two panelists. This is a short version of the CV. You find the long one on their websites and on the Goethe website. So Matthew Morrison is from Charlotte, North Carolina, as an associate professor at NYU, Clive Davis Institute of Recorded Music. He holds a PhD in musicology from Columbia University. His work has appeared in journals like American Music and Oxford Handbooks. Matthew's book Black Sound, Making Race in Popular Music in the United States, was released recently, I think in April or May. He has received fellowships from institutions like Harvard Mellon Foundation and consults for art organizations as Warner Music or Sony. Alexander Ghedi Weheliye is a Malcolm S. Forbes professor at Brown University, I think since 2 years, you told me. He's teaching critical theory, Black literature, gender studies, and popular culture. He's the author of Phonographies, Habeas Viscos, and Fenin, several books, and his current projects include Modernity Hesitant, which explores marginality in modern civilization, and Schwarzsein, examining blackness as an ungendered ontology. His work appears in numerous journals and anthologies, including Black Europe and the African Diaspora. So for sure, that's a short version, and I missed a lot, but you can look it up, what else is going on. So before starting the panel, I want to thank the Harvard Art Museum once again for this wonderful partnership, the panelists for coming here, the audience for being with us, and of course, the Goethe team for making this happen, Annette Klein, our fantastic program creator, and Hannah, our intern. So thanks for being with us. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Deswegen. Thank you. Thank you, Jörg. Thank you, Annette. Thank you, Matthew, for joining the conversation. So what I thought I'd do was take a few minutes to give a little bit of a background to kind of contextualize Milli Vanilli and what happened with Milli Vanilli within the history of Blackness in particularly German popular music. The one thing that I think that the documentary is really great in a lot of ways. One of the things that's really not addressed in the documentary, I think that really had a lot to do with the backlash against Milli Vanilli, was homophobia. Because there's like, as you can see in terms of how they were being imitated and things like that. And I remember very, very clearly that a lot of the tenor was about that. So, yeah. Of course, we can't have any history without Boney M. And this is the other group, that's Boney M. Also just kind of like, you know, the slavery imagery that is going on there. Eruption was another Black American group that Frank Farian produced in the 1970s. And of course, all of this started with Boney M, because what happened in Boney M is that the women singers, they sang all of their own vocals, whereas Bobby Farrell, I want to say is his name, Farrell is the last name. He was hired as a dancer, but Frank Farian performed all the male vocals on the Boney M records that sold 80 million copies across the world. This was one of their biggest hits from 1978, Rivers of Babylon. I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this. Here are a few other examples of the kind of representation of Black musicianship in particularly German disco music produced, Eurodisco produced in Germany, Goombay Dance Band, very, very big group, Silver Convention, with an actual Black German singer. Usually most of the Black musicians were, at least in their presentation, not Black and German, right? That a lot of what the appeal was, that they were clearly marked as being not German, as being either American or from the Caribbean. And here, two more groups that featured Black members. And if you see here, this is Brad Howell, who's one of the vocalists in Milli Vanilli. And he was both in Chile as a vocalist and a writer. And he also did credited but background vocals for Supermax. So again, this is kind of part of a longer tradition. And this is sort of the most egregious version. They were kind of a Eurodisco holiday Kirmes band, the Saragossa band. And they either had Black members or literal blackface, right? And this is from 1982 or 1981, as it says there. So this was not that far removed from Milli Vanilli. And I know that Matthew is going to talk about how Milli Vanilli kind of fits into a certain blackface tradition as well. And the thing is that I think that is really important in terms of how Milli Vanilli started was that Blackness was this very, very important part of Eurodisco produced in Germany, right? By Frank Farian and many others. And it was usually in the form of a kind of sexualized exoticism, right? This is something that happens again and again. And even with Milli Vanilli, this is something that happens. And in the wake of Milli Vanilli, a number of similar groups spring up, not only in Germany, but all across Europe, right? In the late 80s and early 1990s. And in stark contrast to many other forms of electronic music, most of the faces, at least, if not the vocals, are by Black musicians. And just a few examples. Of course, Milli Vanilli, Culture Beat from Germany, Snap from Germany, Black Box from Italy, Technotronic from Holland, Two Unlimited also from Holland. This was kind of the most expansive representation of Blackness and Black Europeanness that existed at that particular moment, right? And I think that's also one of the ways in which Milli Vanilli is downplayed in terms of their importance as being representatives of Black Europeanness, right? Which I think was important despite them not doing the vocals. And here you have the list. And you see here that most of these groups and performers are from Germany. The other thing that I think that also Milli Vanilli, that's an important part of the story, is if you remember early in the film, Rob talks about his early life, right? Having a Black GI father and a white German mother, but being in an orphanage. And this is something that continues in terms of a lot of the kind of faces of these groups being Black American GIs that were stationed at some point in Germany, right? Let me see how much time I have. I only have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to keep. And we already saw. I also wanted to point out that someone just told me that Blame It on the Rain is actually featured in the Menendez brother Netflix series in a pivotal moment. So the music still exists, right? Despite Milli Vanilli being vilified. And also Blame It on the Rain is an amazing song. I wanted to give you another example in terms of Frank Farian, very, very kind of big profile. This is more a small-timey, at least initially, white Berlin producer and how he engaged with Blackness throughout the years, beginning in the 1980s. His name is Olaf O.J. Jeglitzer.
But here are guys who I've seen in every illustrated in magazines. Said all time the same game, playing with my goodness, standing in a hall of fame, and I got the whole thing. Yes, that's right, but that's not all. We are the M-A-S-T-E-R play.
And then he had a second group.
We're here, we're back.
And then he kind of found his groove with the group that will at some point become World Conquering, which is the Real McCoy. And this is their first song from 1990. It's On You, and it's credited to MC Sar, even though MC Sar does not exist.
MCSA, all right. In the heat of the night, pump up the party, turn off the light. Back like just an illusion. On the mic, clear the confusion. Get up and dance into the funky groove. Where all the party people move. So come on, get up, take it to the top. Don't stop that body rock. Yes, do the new jack hustle. Shake your booty, flex your muscles. Everybody, shake your body. It's MC's hip house party. Like the drummer with a mic in a hand. Let's go and
Champro, the black German performer, he's miming actually the raps of Olaf Jeglitzer, the white German producer. Later on in the video, Patsy Peterson mimes her own parts, and the two black performers are the focal points, and they also perform in clubs to playback on without the white German producer. And a lot of what I'm trying to highlight here is that what happened with Milli Vanilli was not really the exception, right? And I think we were talking in the other room a little bit earlier, people in Germany were not nearly as incensed and as upset about, what Milli Vanilli did, because there was a kind of longer tradition, of these Eurodance and Eurodisco groups that were basically invented by producers that would hire attractive performers, right? That was kind of, something that happened. I mean, it happened in other contexts too. The Village People, for instance, would be a more well-known example.
I talk to you in the night, in the dream of love so true. I talk to you in the night, in the dream of love so true.
In the night, in my dreams, I'm in love with you. Cause you talk to me like a person. I feel joy.
Yes. So now he has vocals that are performed by Karin Kaza is her name. And in the video, they're mimed by the black German woman, Patsy Peterson, even though she was a singer on the first record. They're just like all these kind of weird machinations. And he also puts himself in the videos, right? But this is before the group becomes successful in the United States. And when that happens, he really puts himself back into the background, even
just another night, another vision of love. You feel joy, you feel pain, cause nothing will be the same. Just another night, it's all that it takes to understand the difference between lovers and fate. So baby, I talk to you in the night, in the dream of love so true. I talk to you.
And after they become massively successful in the United States, they hire another black German singer. And until the end, it's the white German producer with the two black women. And like I said, this kind of has a long tradition. And it's also a way that kind of German national culture negotiated blackness in the from the 1970s well into the into the 1990s, if not the 2000s. So just to kind of highlight that point and to think about it in this broader context. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much Alex, for inviting me here with you to be in conversation at the Goethe-Institut. And thank you also to the Institute for inviting me as well. I thought that I would take an opportunity to follow up or to complement really Alex's discussion on the sort of 70s context, 70s and 80s context to the 90s and even in today, thinking about the sort of representational aspects, the sonic components of, and sort of what is the larger context out of which all of these sort of pop music global phenomena develop, right? And my area of specialization in particular is that of blackface minstrelsy, which is an American phenomenon, right, that traveled internationally almost right away. And I think that there's a way, especially when we look at how unapologetic someone like Frank Farian is, right, in his relentless pursuit of abstracting blackness in order to capitalize and also make himself, right, into a particular figure and understand his own sort of fit within the world through popular music, through sort of abstracting blackness. And I really want to consider what that means in the context of the sort of larger historical trajectory of Black performance and Black abstraction in the German context. So I had a timer. iPad. All right. And so I am actually going to be talking very briefly about a little topic here. Black performance and blackness in Germany before the Jazz Age, because I think that there is more of a discussion, understanding, right, of what happens, in the interwar period leading up to the proliferation of jazz throughout Germany and Europe in particular. But there was a large presence, right, of Black musical performance, particularly from the United States in Germany throughout the 19th century as it come to understood its own self, right, as a nation. And I think that that is important in our larger discussions of even how someone like Rob eventually, as they discussed the way that he was even received as a small child born in Germany in the 1980s in reference to his skin or reference to him being, sort of not German, essentially. And so I actually want to, again, sort of give a brief historical trajectory beginning with one, and really kind of focus on performance, right? So Black performance, in particular from the United States, continues to really shape and influence in various ways the way that Blackness is perceived in a German context, right? Even though it has its own specificities there. And so in 1858, there was a man by the name of David F. Dorr, who traveled to Germany, to Europe, and was toured by his enslaver, right? But while he was toured by his enslaver, and Black man who was enslaved in the United States, was toured by his enslaver across Europe. And in 1858, he went to Hamburg. And this is a quote directly from David F. Dorr here, which I find quite fascinating. I have just been to Goethe's house. It has stood the seething weather of the Main for 500 years, but none of the calamities of the time have laid their fingers upon it. And this was, again, when he visited Goethe's house in Europe, and this was in, again, 1858. What's interesting about his visitation there is that we really don't get a sense of how he was received, because when he wrote his travelogue upon returning to the United States and was re-enslaved, he actually wrote within the larger tradition there of a travelogue, giving his account and perceptions of what was happening in various places throughout Europe upon his own sort of observations. And so we get him, sort of just telling us and recounting his reception and sort of experience of what Germany was at that time, and then also returning to the United States, sort of wishing in a way for the freedom that he felt that he had in that land versus when he went back to the United States and was re-enslaved. What I think is interesting about this, though, is that even in this small sort of even in this singular sort of instance, we already have a sort of this Black figure who begins to really introduce in a particular way the way that Blackness is perceived in that context. And so, as we continue to move throughout the 19th century, there are several performers, and there's a really wonderful resource called Black Central Europe that really has a map that I may bring up here that'll show you throughout the 19th century, there were dozens upon dozens upon dozens of Black American in particular performers who toured throughout Germany. Okay. And so this here, I wanted to briefly bring in this idea again of the Berlin Negro colony, which I'll just read this here, which includes about 60 people, surely are among the most interesting residents of Berlin. They can be separated into two different classes, the blacks who came from America and the Negroes who were being brought to the spree. Directly from Africa, without exception, they occupy a service role. The most distinguished is Sayo, the Moor of Prince Karl. When Bancroft Davis and Bayard Taylor came as ambassadors to Berlin, they brought Negroes with them. Both remained here after they finished their service. Taylor's servant is now a runner for a business at Leipziger Street. Some of them have not only mastered German, but have also developed a proper Berlin dialect with ich and wat. 3 Negroes have married white women, and their children find among their classmates very willing playmates, as you can see if you visit the schools that they attend. This is in 1882. Right? This is before we get to the Second World War, where you have, more of a presence of Afro-Germans because of the black soldiers in that context, right? And so again, I want to just sort of trace a lineage here leading up to this moment where Rob is expressing his own frustrations of not feeling or fitting into or having to be, in many ways, being demonized, right? As we see in the end, for being just who he was in the German context there. Again, and so some of the images that we'll see here, violent images of blackface, right, were quite normalized and regular, and I think connect directly in many ways to the way that Alex showed us that the various producers were wanting to display, right, blackness in a visual sense in the disco era. But this also, again, is a very long lineage of figuring out what is going to sell. Primary audience and market, and the primary audience and market and target audience are the people with the most resources, and in the society structured and dominance, right? The people with the most resources, the people who have a certain level of power, right? So white folks in the United States context, right, are the mainstream sort of imagined audience to whom disco at the time, right, was being sold. And so in a similar context within a German context, the presentation of black performers, whether it was supposed to represent racial ridicule or not immediately, right, was still about presenting blackness to a white audience for their consumption, if that makes sense, okay? And so we have here in 1877 to 1878, the Fifth Jubilee Singers, who were one of the sort of earliest black African-American in a post-emancipation context, vocal groups to really help to sort of spread and share what the actual musical practices, vernacular practices of Black Americans were through the art song to primarily white audiences for abolitionist cause. I mean, for sort of post-emancipation, Black uplift causes, right? And so they toured Europe, right, with their with the chorus master, or the white chorus master, whose last name was White. And we see here that there are various ways in which Black Americans, and the Fifth Jubilee Singers in particular, were depicted in the 1870s and 80s in the German press. And we can see this also throughout Europe. They're following the same trope, either of presenting them through the sort of blackface caricature, that regardless of how the sounds that are coming from the performer sound, they are always overdetermined, right, by the sort of racialized notions of how they are to be perceived by the audience, right? And then in the second picture here, we see, rendering here, we see the more respectable presentation of the Fifth Jubilee Singers, right? And even still, there's various ways that this particular piece is described as also still allowing and alluring to a particular gaze, right? But within this, we can also see that there are various conceptions and presentations of blackness in the latter part of the 19th century in Black performance already circulating throughout German media, right? And then one of the another sort of large theatrical venture that was popular in Germany. Again, and I think what's important about this is again, we're talking about right in the same era and time that Germany became unified, right? And so like in the unification of Germany, the nationalization of Germany is also the racialization of Blackness in various ways, right? And I think that's important, again, as we get to sort of contextualizing and understanding what is really going on at multiple levels with Milli Vanilli and Frank Farian in particular, and the reception of these artists. And so Uncle Tom's Cabin, again, written by Harris Beecher Stowe, which toured as an abolitionist work, but also, you know, it's complicated because of the way that it still uses and presents Blackness through a stereotyped, mistral-like dialect and various representations, right? But it was very popular at the Berlin Victoria Theater. Here, and we see Jarrett and Palmer's Uncle Tom's Cabin Company, which were almost in many cases, depending on the venue, but quite often indistinguishable from blackface minstrel troupes that also toured these very same spaces quite often. And then as we move closer into, so again, we've already, from 1858 to 1896, we've already had sort of a presence and a movement of Blackness, and in this case, Black Americanness, through Germany. And so by the time that, again, we get to this moment where the Volkerschauung and the inaugural German colonial exhibition become the norm, this also begins to shape the way that Germans nationalize themselves in relation to, quote, others with the capital O, right? And so you have these various gardens, right? And these villages coming from places in Africa, the Congo, Ashanti villages from various places, Native American villages being sort of plopped into these gardens, right? And then Germans are able to go and basically spectate, interact, and develop various understandings of both themselves in relation to these othered people within a zoological garden, basically a human zoo, okay? And this was super common. And I imagine that, you know, those of us here may already be familiar with that. And so to wrap up here, I'm coming into the 20th century now, early 20th century. By this time, blackface representation had found itself as a common sort of part of representing blacks, but also as a part of marketing and selling items, right? And so here you have in 1906 from the Hannoversches Tageblatt a advertisement of Carlsbad coffee using these blackface representations, right? And so when we think about how the circulation, right, of these particular images, of these exoticized, of these racialized, of these stereotyped, of these racist images become sort of steeped into the imaginary again as this German national identity is being formed, that gets us directly to, again, thinking about, you know, what is at stake when someone like Frank Farian comes through to use these various moments to basically ventriloquize his own ideas of blackness through whiteness to then create an entire economy, right? Multi-million dollar, $486 million, they said, in the 80s off of Milli Vanilli. Gargantuan, right? And so this is the sort of context that I want us to think about these more contemporary developments. And this is sort of after that moment that I just showed there in 1908, a translation of the sort of way that Afro-Germans are beginning to be perceived as being too big for their britches at this point. So this is already in 1908. So we can also, again, understand the larger context out of which Rob or understands himself within Germany. So I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you all.
No, it's on. I just want to say two things to kind of bring us up historically to the 1970s that I think is important. Is during the Third Reich, during the Nazi period, a lot of Black Germans, or a sizable number of Black Germans, were able to survive because they were needed to perform in films as being particularly Black people in the former German colonies, right? So there was like a whole, and there were also live shows, et cetera, and so on. So it was one of the few ways that Black Germans could sort of survive. And then after the war, while the Black German children, you know, there was like a plan to adopt them to the United States, which actually worked, et cetera, and so on, while they were routinely rejected. And the other thing that I think is also important to remember about like a story like Rob's is that it's always made to seem that particularly the fathers just abandoned the children. But oftentimes, the U.S. Army made it really difficult for the couples to stay together. You know, well into the 1950s, when segregation was the norm in a lot of American states. And then the German government also made it really difficult for the couples to stay together. All of those things are happening.
Family relations as well. I have a dear friend
yes.
in Atlanta whose grandmother came from Germany because her family said there is no way that you were going to be with that black man. And so she's like, well, I'm leaving.
Yeah. I was actually just watching this documentary from the 1950s, and the journalist asks all these white German mothers with black children if they want to give the children up. And all of them say no. And it's really, really clear that so much of like what his goal is in that interview is to say, you can't actually take care of these children. You can't be serious doing this, et cetera, and so on. So just to kind of highlight the pressure. But while all of those things were going on, there were also a number of blues and jazz tours that went throughout all of Germany that were supremely successful in the 1950s and 1960s. There is a way in Germany where blackness is acceptable so long as it's not ever actually German, right? And I think that Milli Vanilli kind of fell into that too, because it was easy enough to kind of position them as not being German, even though, you know, especially Rob was extremely German, right, in terms of his accent particularly, and so on. So yeah, I think, you know, again, these are not all the same thing, but there are all these different kinds of traditions where blackness and music or film, entertainment are kind of tied together in the sort of German imagination. Of course, this also happens in other ways, but I think it has a particular kind of valence in Germany.
I agree, and I think the thing that really strikes me also in this context is the abstraction of blackness in making. So one of the things that I think about in the U.S. context is how abstracting blackness is also enables the making of whiteness, right, in the U.S. concept. But I also think that figures into a certain formation of a German identity as white that excludes, right, those who born in Germany, you know, again, lineage. And we can go back to the Middle Ages, but I thought here I would just do 19th century. But yeah, so there's this thing that I try to also get to when we talk about consumption, right? There's more going on than just the market. You know what I mean? There's something happening internally. There's something happening between folks. There's something happening communally. There's something happening structurally. And I mean, and we can't, Frank didn't appear. Frank is now deceased, right? He died last year, was it?
Oh, I didn't even know.
24, right? Oh, yeah, it was recently, right?
Okay.
Wow.
There's
really, so we can't get a sense, but there is, I think there is really something to this idea of consumption to the point of what Bell Hooks calls eating the other, right? So in the same way that Milli Vanilli almost cannibalized, they had to drink that Kool-Aid, but also in a way to try to move away from the control, right? There's a cannibalization that's really weird that also I think is connected to a particular kind of zoological exoticization, distancing from blackness that is allowed through these histories that I tried to very quickly outline.
No, and I think also, even though Milli Vanilli is not blackface, strictly speaking, they did perform a certain idea of blackness, which allowed them to be successful, right? And part of that was downplaying the Germanness and the Frenchness, right? And kind of, embracing this more, what you would call the kind of abstract like form of blackness, right? But yeah, that advertisement is not the only advertisement. There was a chocolate company until very recently, Zarotti, that had like a little more child as its symbol, right? And this is something that happened well into the 1990s. So, and yeah, there is definitely that abstraction that allows for a certain kind of consumption, right?
a couple of questions. There's a lot of things running through my head right now. So Rob, he isn't that old. I think he's younger than me. So he was
64.
So
He
it's
was born
way
in
after
64.
the war. So you really didn't have those GI, well, you still did in a sense, yes.
Yes.
The other thing that comes to mind is Josephine Baker, who was very famous in France, but again, did blackness. I mean, she ran around with a banana skirt. But then there's also Roberto Blanco and Donna Summer in Germany. Now, Roberto Blanco, I think he's German, maybe not, but he has been around forever.
He's from the Dominican Republic.
Yeah, but he has been around forever, and he does the Schlager all in German. And then Donna Summer, she was a great, great hit at the disco area. But I think the fascinating thing, like you described, is that blackness. There is something fascinating about it. Now, if it's your next door neighbor, yes, you probably have some stereotypes and prejudices against black people, maybe, in general. But when it comes to music, I think they're perceived as talented. They all look attractive. There's no person that is black that is unattractive. And they just do great music. Now, is that me as a white person, is that something, if I say this, is that racist or is that ignorant, or I don't know, where do I put my thoughts to this? That's all I have to say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very complicated because I think the kind of what you're saying, I mean, and Roberto Blanco also really, he has a career because he plays up this kind of being a kind of jester, if you will, right? Being a clown, right? That's kind of how he sort of has been able to exist. And in some ways kind of playing up the stereotypical dimensions of his blackness, but on the other hand, also always kind of pretending like he's not different than like the Germans, right? So yeah, I think, but I think also the kind of like all black people are attractive thing, that is part of the kind of abstraction that Matthew was talking about. And I think that's also why Milli Vanilli could do what they were able to do. That's why Frank Farian was able to do that with Milli Vanilli and not with a white German group, right? I think he tried it with a couple of white performers at some point, right? But it never worked. It was never Boney M, and it was never Milli Vanilli. And with Boney M, it was also really clear. It wasn't only blackness. It was this kind of very sort of like exotic form of blackness, right? That it had to be like this kind of Caribbeanness, et cetera, and so on. That again, didn't actually have all that much to do with real Caribbeans, but it was this idea of Caribbeanness that was being that was being sold. So yeah, I think all of those things definitely play a role, right? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think the way that Donna Summer is sold, especially now, I think less so then, is that she kind of humanized and brought a certain kind of soul to particularly the sort of Eurodisco sound, right, that Giorgio Moroder embraced at some point. She actually got to Germany because she was a musical performer. She was performing in Hair, the musical. And she was part of a touring group. And then she ended up staying, and she was in a relationship with, that's also why she's called Summer, because she was married to a German man named Sommer. And then they anglicized it for the U.S. market, but she was kind of part of that traveling circuit of blackness, and she ended up staying. So yeah,
fascinating, and I think it also fits into just what you said as well, is that black entertainers, especially from America in the European context, are and I think that's part of that as well.
Linked to Donna Summer, we had this scene in the film where these Rob and Fab were signing the contract, and we learned that there was an incredible low sum of money paid for what they were doing. Do you know more about Donna Summer's form of her relationship to her producer, and was it a form of exploitation as well? Can we compare these two cases somehow, anyhow?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know anything about the details of Donna Summer's contract. I think, you know, when she definitely renegotiated her contract at the end of the 1970s, because she was the biggest pop star in the world, I think she got decently paid, right? She works hard for the money. So she got decently paid. I think initially, you know, I mean, if I'm looking at what I know about the history of the music industry, the history of the music industry is from the 1920s, or the recording industry from the 1920s is based on the exploitation of Black music and Black performers, right? So I would think that at some point she fit into it, because so many other performers, you know, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, you know, all of them were exploited at one point or another. But I do think that she had a certain amount of power because she had such great success, right? But I don't think that that was initially. It was something. It's the same thing with Michael Jackson. I'm sure, you know, the initial contracts with Motown were horrible. But by the time you get to the late 1970s, Stevie Wonder, you know, Marvin, I mean, there's all these stories about them having to renegotiate their contract and, you know, A, getting more money, and B, also having a certain kind of artistic freedom, right, to do the kind of work that they wanted. And with Donna Summer, it was like she wanted to embrace like rock music, for instance, you know, from Bad Girls onward. So yeah, I think there's definitely something there. There's definitely something there. Donna Summer was also from Boston. Yeah, and she, until late in her life, spoke beautiful German.
Also, you know, something that I think is important to think about around Milli Vanilli and this sort of idea of Blackness is fascinating, especially from the perception of a sort of German white lens, right? Or you know, the sort of attractiveness or being attracted to Blackness or Black skin even. There's a wonderful book by Krista Thompson called Shine that talks quite a bit about the sort of complexity of skin and Black skin in particular. But there's an interesting way, Alex and I were sort of talking about this a little bit during, where, you know, Milli Vanilli, because they are so attractive. I was eight years old. You know, I don't think I had a real perception. When I saw the documentary, I was like, geez, Louise, you know, like,
they were especially Fab.
My gosh. I was like, now I understand, you know, as a kid. I was like, okay, whatever, you know. But at any rate, but because they, you know, they are so stunning, but they understood their stunningness within the context of what it meant to be Black men, right? In France, in Paris, or in in Germany. And so there's a way I think that even in a documentary you can kind of see it, but those were some very sharp and talented brothers. Okay, they might not have had the best voices initially. A lot of pop artists don't, as we know, okay? And we were also talking about this, like there were a whole bunch of folk, I honestly, as a kid at that time, did not understand why everyone felt so betrayed, because in my mind, everybody lip-synced. I was like, isn't that just what people do, like lip-sync? I didn't realize that that people were so upset because they felt betrayed because it wasn't actually them singing. I'm like, the people who were singing can't sing. And that's why they lip sync all the time, you know? So what is the big deal? But at any rate, like Fab, did you see him on his toes when he danced? I mean, they were so skilled that they did not even have to do any actual development to present them, right? They understood. And again, for me, this goes back to the legacy of blackface. Like everything's blackface. Even the recording contracts, right? The popular music industry starts in the United States, right? In the United States context, the popular music industry starts in the 19th century during slavery out of blackface. So already, from its very basis, the model is exploitative. And it's extracting Blackness for that exploitation. And that's what the entire economy is built around, okay? And presenting U.S. American nationalness through this abstraction of Blackness, through these commercial ventures to the rest of the world, which also builds up the United States as the entity that it is, while making itself sort of not really. I'm doing something else, y'all. So anyway, I'm sorry. That was real loud. But Milli Vanilli, there's a way that I mean, and they were so young, like these 18, 19-year-old boys knew, oh, let me did my hair, or let me do these long things here, or, you know, let's wear, I mean, everyone would, you know, it was the 80s, right? But they really understood style and presentation and the market. I mean, they were doing their own A&R in ways that other
and
A&Rs
performance. And that's what they were getting paid for, right? So to speak. Yeah.
So you had mentioned it when you were doing your talk, and I wonder if you could speak more about that. The fact that the film kind of, before it showed Fab's family, it went into a direction where it kind of leads the audience to wonder about their relationship together,
Yeah.
whether or not they had a more relationship than just a friendship.
Yeah.
But it kind of went directly to, oh, and he has a family.
Yeah.
And so that was interesting. And could you talk more about that perception, why, and how that led to the backlash, such harshness in the backlash?
And I'm also thinking I hadn't really thought about that part of it as like, but I completely agree with you. But I'm also thinking when Ingrid was talking about the relationship, quote unquote, that she had with Rob, I'm not sure that this is true, but that she felt the need to say that it was never sexual, right? Or how she's defining sexual. Let me put it that way. Like, I don't, you know. Precisely. But I do think, and I remember a few people talking about this, like not immediately after the kind of, you know, the moment of truth, but later in the 1990s, that there was definitely a kind of idea that a lot of the backlash, especially in the United States, against Milli Vanilli was homophobic, right? That they were kind of perceived as beautiful, and perhaps too beautiful to be straight, right? I hadn't really thought about the Rob and Fab. Like, I mean, perhaps, you know, I would definitely ship them, you know, and who knows what happened between them. But even if it didn't happen, I do think that they are, in the way that people cast them, they're definitely cast as queer figures, right? In the sense that, you know, they were pretty, they were just, you know, performing emptiness, et cetera, and so on. They were wearing too tight clothes, you know, where Arsenio Hall, who should not be one to talk, where he was like imitating them, right? And then they were talking about how their the tights were too tight, et cetera, and so on. So I definitely think there was, the backlash was definitely racist. It was just like, you are Black, you offered us this. This is the social contract that we have, right? With you as a Black performer. But it was also like, you were doing all this and you're not even conforming to like traditional notions of like cishet Black masculinity, right? So, which at that point was also not really easy because they would have been perceived as threatening, right? Yeah, they wouldn't be able to they couldn't be pop. This is, remember, before NWA blows up, right? So it's like, it's a very, very kind of, it's a fine line that had to be towed. But I definitely do think that I wish that, I'm not surprised that they didn't, but I wish the documentary had brought up that a lot of the tenor against them, by not only Black people, but also everyone, was definitely homophobic, right? Not the fans, but the people that were sort of disappointed, right? The adults, that even if they were not called gay, that was part of, at least, you know, that's what I definitely felt, and what a lot of other, particularly Black queer people, felt in these responses, right?
It's also makes me think of just to this point as well. The backlash. I mean, it's such a. I mean, the backlash was, and so again, as an 8-year-old, I can still feel it in my body, like what it was like when it was just all over the place, right? Well, no, I wasn't 8 then. I was older than 12 or something. but what's really it's you know it's let me see, how do I say this? Oh, go ahead, please. Yeah, because I'm trying to frame. Please, yeah, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely.
That word,
Yeah.
Yes.
scapegoat.
Yep,
And
absolutely.
so, like, I don't know if that's what you were kind of thinking, but it's like they weren't the ones who made all the money.
No.
They weren't
Absolutely.
the ones who wrote and drafted the contract that locked them into those terms. But for some reason, their faces were everywhere, and the other guy got away scot-free. So like that.
Okay, I wrote that down initially. Scapegoated, but like
But
when
it's in your book, too.
it started.
And even all the people that worked at the record companies, both in Germany and in the United States, right?
They all knew, and then the guy sat up there and was like, "Well, I don't know if we knew."
Like, who is it? Yeah.
I actually, I had a question, and it's just like words I'm going to throw out, and hopefully you guys will believe the question. But I think it was, sorry, I think I heard Fab say something about he mimed pulling strings out of his arms, and he said that he was a marionette.
Yeah.
And it reminded me of and then you also said this wasn't quite blackface, but to me, it felt like blackface using their bodies. For him, what's the guy name? The producer.
Frank Farian.
For Frank Farian
yeah.
to be able to perform via their bodies. And so I wonder if, well, two things. One is this related to the, I think you call it racialized ventriloquism? And how does the fact that he was a producer using this technology, kind of reaching into phonographies, using this technology that kind of separates the sound from the source, such that he's like cobbling together all these, different people to make this sound and then an image, and he's just, it's kind of like, how is this? So I just wanted to know, and also the copyright issue and the contracts and all of that. I just wanted to see what you guys wanted to say in context of Black sound and phonographies.
I was just going to very quickly, what I was thinking about with the vehemence of the backlash is that it also kind of mirrored the backlash to the death of disco, right? And so, and we know that also.
The images, when I saw those, it looks very much like the disco demolition.
And then it looks just, and it also.
And the book burnings in Nazi Germany, it must be said.
Hello. And so, the impetus behind, people were so mad at disco, well, that was after it had become, so ubiquitous across the whole entire world, and they had extracted millions and millions and millions of dollars off of it. And then the attack was on the Black people and the queer people, right? That's what the whole disco demolition that went down in Chicago with the big field, that's what that was about, right? And so I think there's a similar sort of way that queerness and Blackness become scapegoated, and everybody can get on board across the racialized and, and gender demographics. Absolutely. Yeah. But I appreciate you bringing in this, the concept of the sort of racialized ventriloquy that I think about in my own work and around Black sound, because that is very much what's happening, right? Yeah. So, you articulated it very clearly. So I'm just affirming what you said, right? And again, within racialized ventriloquy, there are so many things happening, right? Including the making and imagining of self, right? And so what does it mean that after having voiced the voice of Boney M, that wasn't enough, right? And 80 million records, that wasn't enough, there was something, the greed, but there was something that, I can't say because I didn't know Frank, but again, I would, there is something else going on beyond just the dollar.
He got away with it.
And got away with it, as far as we know, but so with the racialized ventriloquy, I like to make sure that we understand that as an embodied process, not just as an abstraction. As I talk about abstractions, like those abstractions of Blackness get embodied, by folks who can take on at will, whether or not they're actually covering one's face, right? And the systems of power and structures allow for them to be seen or not, depending on how they fit within that, because this is also why, Blackness becomes the abstraction of becomes the way that, so many minoritized people in the United States begin to enter into the popular sphere, right? Because of the expectation that they're, white Jewish women at the turn of the 20th century, Sophie Tucker, she couldn't get on the popular stage because she did not fit, you know, the ideal of a particular womanhood, right, to even be allowed on the stage. And so how did she enter into that? By singing her version of the blues coon songs, right, in blackface initially, adopting these, and then was able to transform that into adopting her own self in presentations to becoming one of the first major, you know, vaudeville stars of the early 20th century, right? And so it's, you know, it can be exploitative, and it also, you know, has like levels of complexity within that exploitation. But Frank, that man, he just, I just don't know. I don't know what we do about that.
Let me just say one thing about Frank Farian and this whole thing, both with Boney M and with Milli Vanilli. I think it's really important to actually call this blackface, even though it doesn't actually involve him putting, you know, black paint on his face, because this is what was happening, and that's why I think you know, it's really important to have this conversation, to think about the continuities between what was going on in the 19th century into the late 20th century, right? I think it's also because he got away with it with Boney M. I think he probably thought, maybe I can't get away with it in this way, right? Because we're in 1988 now, and we're not in 1974, and it's a different it's a different day and age, right? The caricature was, but also if you go back and listen to those Boney M recordings, Bobby's quote unquote voice does not sound black in any way. Right, it's really clear what is going on. So yeah, I think it's important to name this as blackface, both in terms of what Frank Farian was doing, but also in terms of the kind of blackness that Rob and Fab were performing, right? Because it wasn't only like their version of lived blackness, they were also trying to conform to a certain idea of, you know, abstracted, global, not exclusively Black American, but close to Black American.
And they were Black American songs. Their very first song was written by a Baltimore crew. That was what's the song?
What is it? Girl, You Know It's True. It was released by a Baltimore group.
It was a Baltimore
It was a
group.
cover version. It was not written by Frank Farian.
And it is an amazing song on its own, right? And so that already initiated the popularity. But then I thought, you know, as I was watching the documentary for a second time, I was like, damn, if Frank Farian hadn't been such a fucked up person, we might not have got that amazing song. But then I had to check my own self and remind myself that there are, you know, that there are, they get sort of conditioning of sort of a lack. It's like there could have been so many other opportunities for, you know, things to rise if that had not consumed so much space, even though it was an amazing song that they really, I mean, like watching them perform that, even, and he was an amazing lip syncer, the rapper anyway. And so, you know.
Is this on? Okay. I think this has all been so incredible and so incredibly helpful to think through blackface and how that actually works in this context. And I kept thinking as you were talking about the moment where they're all sort of surprised that Rob seemed to think he was singing the songs himself. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, how else do you embody, how else do you actually create a sense of self, right? So as tragic as the story is, and as you were just talking now and talking about actually the American context, that's what I kept seeing when we were watching the film, and I kept thinking, okay, what does this have to do with Germany? How is this German? And so thank you also for showing actually the history very briefly as you could, but the history of Black Germans and performance and those very fraught legacies. But I want to ask a little bit more, why is it then the American backlash? Because you both mentioned it, they mentioned in the film that the American backlash was so much worse. Why? Because I sort of feel we have the same histories of performance in the United States and relationship with Black performance and Black performers. What is it then about what makes it so different, I guess?
I think it's really about, you know, back in the day, people used to call it rockism. that I think that the kind of history of the way that music is perceived, popular music in the United States, is very much tied to ideas about realness and authenticity in this kind of very deep way. And I think because non-English speaking countries knew for a long time that they couldn't really compete with Anglophone popular music, that traditions developed there where it was all about artifice, right? You have all these interesting stories in the 1970s and 1980s of producers from all over Europe, disco producers, post-disco producers, working with Luther Vandross, working with Lolita Holloway, working with all these American singers, but also just like in this case, hiring people to mime and having other people do that. So having other people do, quote unquote, the actual work. So I think, and I think to a certain extent, this is even true for the UK, that there is this idea that pop music is artifice. And it's performance, and it's not necessarily real, authentic, and it's not like something that comes from deeply from inside the performers, but it's about putting on a good show.
So it's more about that than it is about sort of understandings of national identity, because I kept thinking too, is it because they were and somehow presented, and when we're hearing American voices, or they didn't like that he sounded French, and they didn't like that he sounded Bavarian. I mean, not even German, but Bavarian, God forbid, you know, that then they are, I don't know, somehow being identified with on a more national level. Because I keep thinking, okay, citizenship in Germany, right? Very complicated issue, 1913, right? You have to have German blood, right? This is coming from colonial Germany, right? Yeah. This is coming for fears of miscegenation, and and that doesn't change until 2000. Yeah. So we're in a country where Frank Farian is selling his product very successfully, but no one's getting quite as upset about it until the United States.
I think that's one other part of it, right? I think both are at play. And I do think that even though it was really clear that especially Rob was German, it was never really that important because, as I keep saying, they were very much selling this idea of a kind of global blackness, right? And part of that was, as you just also pointed out, that you don't hear the traces of the accents on the recordings, right? So yeah, I think that definitely also flowed into it, in the sense that people didn't have this idea that this is Rob and he's ours in Germany, right? Whereas I think people in the United States, especially fans, might have had a stronger sense of ownership.
Yeah, I agree. To add to that, also, it's interesting to me that they were also kind of lambasted for not sounding the same in the recording as they were in speaking, because most, British singers, especially then, did not sound. They had an American singing accent, right? That was the norm in that moment. So it's really interesting. But I was just going to sort of add, I do think that the American media machine is part of the reason why there was such a huge backlash, including the Grammys. I think that they were very right in a documentary, because sometimes documentaries can create a narrative, as we know, to kind of make something more than it was. I do think the Grammys was like a moment of great betrayal, and then they were betrayed by Black people who were not American. So there was, so there are like three levels, right? And then also I think that there's an interesting way that, again,
and who didn't seem super straight,
and who didn't, cannot leave that out. And then there's also, I think that, because the United States has a lot of Black people. So it's kind of like what happened with blackface in the 19th century. Once Black Americans were allowed on the blackface stage, right? Because initially it was almost all white men in blackface, or, ethnic American white men. English, Irish, Scottish, primarily, some German, Italian, a little bit. But it's here in the context of the United States. Once Black people entered into the popular stage, then the white performers really started to seem like a farce, right? And so the white minstrelsy shifted at that point in its own articulation, because Black performers were turning tricks, performing tricks around them, right? And so they're kind of developed a sort of, a separation of black minstrelsy and white minstrelsy even stronger in that particular time. But I think that particular legacy also says something, again, going back to Alice's point around this idea of a certain type of like black authenticity, right? And even though that was a song written by black Americans, it very much has the, like that sound, the do, 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 do. It has that global, you can throw those when they threw the chants, when that became like a big thing in the 90s, they would put it really is kind of the same background. But again, it's coming from a kind of combination of an early hip hop and like soft R&B context, right? And so again, I think the part of the sort of intensity of the response here has to do with the larger American media landscape, and also the fact that there's a certain relationship to blackness that the black audiences had that might have contributed to the way that Milli Vanilli was perceived, both by black and non-black people.
Interesting footnote. In terms of language and the kind of Anglocentrism of popular music. Until the late 1960s, it was actually very common for American performers to record German, Spanish, French, and in some cases, Greek versions of their songs. So there's
abroad and make money from them because they would
make money of them because it wouldn't sell. There's like a compilation called Motown in German or something like that, and it's like I heard it through the grapevine in German. I don't even remember like how it was translated, but just a kind of interesting spin on how performers kind of had to adjust themselves linguistically in that earlier moment, whereas then later, I think beginning with the disco era really leveled the playing field because you get all these producer-centric musics from all across the world, from the African continent, Asia, the Caribbean, et cetera, and so on. And it finally allowed the non-English speaking performers or producers to really compete, particularly on the US market, but also the UK market. So that's a real shift. But that's like one of the moments where English becomes like very much a global pop music language.
So who owns what when we talk about blackness?
So me saying that is not saying that your ears are wrong or my ears are right. This is not the point, right? The point is that we perceive sound, based on how we understand identity relations, right? And so Amy Winehouse is not supposed to, maybe Amy Winehouse is not supposed to sound like that to your ears. And the closest thing that she's supposed to sound like is black, right? And so that, so I just want to kind of, just point out that our listening practices vary from ear to ear, even though they are greatly shaped by these sort of racialized global notions of how people are supposed to sound based on how they look and their skin complexion, right? And then who owns what? Well, if you're not black, you shouldn't own anything that's not black, right? If you're not black, you shouldn't own. Look, ownership in blackness is very, complicated because of slavery, right? But just in terms of this, so this is something that I specifically write about in my work, and that's why I call black sound, right? One word, capital B, not black sounds, two different words. Black, oh, beautiful. Thank you. I will absolutely sign. But it's the who owns what is honestly a really great question. And when it comes to popular music, again, popular music in the United States in particular, which has a global impact. So it starts between the United States and the UK. And that transaction happens through blackface, unfortunately. And then it goes global right away. So the larger mechanism for popular music in the United States and then globally is structured by this unequal system of blackface, right? That is also happening in a moment where the relationship between property and blackness, right, is completely fraught because black people barely can own themselves in the context of the 19th century. So when copyright laws are developed, they're developed around notions of literacy and what is written, right? So essentially who owns the sounds of black people are the folks who can write them down, get credit for them in publishing, or who can own the record and then say that I own this. So that's who owns it in essence, right? But if you're talking about from a larger, ethical standpoint, then, we have to ask some questions, some more questions, I think.
Okay. I have a few words to say about Amy Winehouse, and I'm going to say this as I've always been a very strong disliker of Amy Winehouse. Like, I'm just like, I literally cannot listen to her. Like, it's a gut level. There are a few other people too where I'm just like, it's irrational. I mean, not completely irrational, but I'm just like, I don't want to hear you sing, like, ever. Like, just don't. But what I want to say, historically speaking, that is important to understand Amy Winehouse, that she is part of a very long tradition of particularly white British working class obsession with Black American music, right? Particularly soul music. And I would definitely say what Amy Winehouse did was blackface. Again, there was not any coloring on her face, but the way. And what I think is also really important about Amy Winehouse, the album that made her really, really successful, she took the musicians and the producer that a Black woman who's passed away now, Sharon Jones, had worked with, and basically copied the sound. Like the whole record. Is it Back in Black? Was that the big one? The big Back to Black. That's what she won the Grammys for. That's what sold millions of copies, etc., and so on. That was like what really catapulted her into superstardom, and it was very much a copy of Sharon Jones and the Dopkins. She hired the Dopkins, the backing band, Sharon Jones's backing band, and she also hired the producer that they had worked with on their last record. So it was a very conscious way in which she put herself in this particular conversation about Black musical histories.
And also, to this point as well, around Amy Winehouse, something happens, and similar to what happens with Milli Vanilli, because Mark Ronson is also very responsible. Okay, the producer who did Bruno Mars's Uptown Funk and all of that, Mark Ronson is very, 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 very much responsible, right? Because Amy Winehouse wasn't popular enough just yet to be able to make the kind of decisions, right, that people think that she was able to make, right? But they saw the potential in Amy Winehouse to be able to be that kind of popular. So someone like Mark Ronson, who was a top producer at that moment, who was also known for his ability to very skillfully abstract Blackness into these very sort of pristine
and it was also, it has to be said, there's also a long, long tradition with various forms of Black popular music. Basically, when the sounds are not popular among Black people anymore, white musicians pick it up and do a kind of retro version of it, right? It happens with jazz. It happens with the blues. Swing music. I mean, all of the things. And I think, because it was a very, very specific kind of retro soul sound that she was going for. She was not producing what was then contemporary R&B, right? She did not sound.
Her voice. There were demos from her recordings from before. Back then, I really liked it, but I also liked it because of its excess. And I didn't expect it to be, but I also didn't know the context of like what had episode later on. But it's I think that.
So one comment and then the question. The comment is, what you were saying about the marionette, and it reminded me of their dance routine. And there's a part where they seem like marionette, actually. So it was really interesting to go back to that. But I wonder, because you did your presentation on this a little bit, and when you went to NYU, I wonder if you went to the Schomburg Center in Harlem, where they actually have this deck of cards of all the African Americans who were forced, because of all the prejudice in this country, to go abroad and sort of develop their talents abroad. And that, Josephine Baker being among them. But
many opera singers and
exactly, but
as musicians, blues musicians,
all of them. At the same time as Josephine Baker's career has demonstrated, and as some of your presentation has demonstrated, they sort of live between this not able to survive in this country and still not have to exploit this idea of zoologicalness, exoticism of Blackness. So I wonder if you can talk about that experience for Americans who are forced to develop their personal talent abroad, especially in the German context, and also the German Black people who are trying to navigate this narrow path as well.
Oh, it's interesting. I think Alex will probably have more to say around the German context, but again, because I can't seem to not tie everything in entertainment back to blackface. But really, there was a reason that once the blackface minstrel troops formed, the first one was called the Georgia Minstrels, and they were led by a black proprietor who kind of passed for white, Sam Hicks, or Hicks or Hay, one of those. But they started touring here, but almost immediately they went abroad to Europe, right? One, because there was already that line of American performers going to Europe from white blackface troops going to Europe. But two, when you look at some of the writing, because there is some writing left for some of them, the idea is that, we can go there and perform the real thing, and again, the real blackface, right? By black people. We can go there and perform the real thing and probably, be quite successful, especially as we're dealing with, in the context of the United States, the backlash to Reconstruction, the Jim Crow, lynching, and the heinous violence leading up to, what happens, leading up to essentially the establishment of Jim Crow post 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So I think that its roots kind of begin there, but then I think it also depends on the genre and the time that we're in, right? So, like, for example, maybe in like the 80s, black opera singers could not get a job in the United States almost at all unless you were Jesse Norman, Leontine Price, or right. So many 1980s. I'm sorry. Yeah, 1980s. Sorry. So there was a whole entire litany of black opera singer performers, right, who developed their careers in Europe because they were better received there than they were here, right? And so we can see the same tropes happening in jazz. And so, like in the in the interwar period, mid-century, right? Jim Crow, black people can't perform, in certain spaces here. Well, they're in Germany. They're like, hey, it's like, wait, Jim Crow, Nazi, like there's some similarities here, but again, they're black and they're American, so we don't have to deal with those similarities in ways. And so it really, it really, this in multiple genres, this really becomes the case, right? Not so much in genres in which black people are expected to sound, right? So hip hop, okay. If they're alternative R&B, depending, they might have a better chance. Feel like they may have a better chance abroad. But the main genres that are connected to race music of black people, those folks don't have to do as much historically. But now, because the market is so wild, everybody got to figure out where they're gonna get their buck at, and it might be here, or it might be in Australia.
And I think it's also really important to highlight again that the kind of celebration of particularly Black American, but also in some cases African artistry, and I will only speak for Germany, but I think you can extrapolate this to other European contexts, it's anti-Black, right? It's very much conditional. It's like you will be accepted in these particular ways. And it almost always, especially in the German context, also depends on displacing local Black people, right? So for instance, what happens in 2020, not 1920. What happens 4 years ago with the George Floyd's protests, et cetera, and so on, that also happened in Germany. There's like all these German institutions, and they're just like, oh yes, we will put on this art show, we will do this conference, et cetera, and so on. In almost every single case, it's Americans that are sometimes Caribbean folks, sometimes African folks that are asked, very seldom Black Germans, right? And it's very much because it sort of highlights this fact of, oh, look at us, how open and non-racist we are. But it really hides the kind of racism against folks on the ground. And I think it's really important to look at those two things at the same time, because so often when, you know, particularly as a Black German person, you know, when I say something, it's like, no, but look, we're doing this. And I'm like, but it's a Black American artist again, which is nice. You know, you should do this. But what about these 5 Black German artists? Like, why don't you support them? Why are they not part of this group exhibit, et cetera, and so on. So I think, yeah, I'll just stop there.
I was telling Alex that I lived in Berlin for a few months on a fellowship, and many of my friends who were local, right, whether they were Afro-German or from another place in Europe or from Africa living there, but particularly the Black Germans would, and as they were pointing out, they were like, yeah, you're going to be treated differently than we are. And I already had a sense of that, but it was also very clear because there were a couple of times where we would go places and they would want to let me in and not let them in. Of course I would go in, right? But it was in Berlin, you can't really say shit if they don't want to let you in a place. You just don't go in. They like the United States, where I may try to raise hell. What I'm gonna do there? But like nothing. But it was very apparent. So that also I think goes back to a certain level of the place that the United States has been able to. It's been able to position itself in the world, you know, through its military powers and prowess, but also specifically through its entertainment, which is an extraction of Blackness, right? And so, you know, there is just a way that there's a certain, you know, desire for, you know, that Americanness through Blackness that, you know, just does not happen in the context of the U.S. Potentially, right? Again, like, I'm not romanticized because I also dealt with some of the most intensely racist experiences that I've had in my life in Berlin.
Because it is anti-Blackness, right?
Hello.
I also studied in Germany in Wallendar, but I lived in Koblenz near Dusseldorf, and I probably was the only Black person in the town. But my question is, what's the difference between Blacks and Negroes? I think I saw you had a slide up that said, this is one of the old slides from like the 80s, whatever. And I think in your book as well, there was something about Blacks versus Negroes. And I'm like, what is the difference? And is that related to how some countries seem to treat their own people of color different than they treat other people of color? Like even in France, like Americans get treated differently from African people and French Black people. So it's not just Germany. And I'm wondering if it's related to that Negro versus Blacks thing, or.
That's an interesting question. So in the context of, and I don't think I properly contextualized the 19th century work before I presented it, but as I'm sure you well know, you know, that is sort of a product of its time, just in terms of the use of the word Negro. And so, but in terms of, you know, but at the root of the word Negro, right, becomes the root of describing Black people, you know, across the European, the Western, across Western Europe since the colonial encounter in many ways, right? And so I wonder, in answering that question, I don't think I have a question for an answer rather for the difference between Negro and Black, aside from temporality, right? So like not being it, like Negro was a word that was primarily used, right, through the civil rights movement, you know, up until the civil rights movement in the U.S. context. And it's interesting too, the way that because European nations for a long time, especially didn't conceive of themselves as racist, would kind of adopt U.S. racial politics and discussing, you know, racial politics in relation to Black people in many ways, especially from a U.S. context. And so I feel like Negro also kind of fell out of vogue in the European context, you know, and not too long after it did here as well. But it is, again, before civil rights, you know, that's the primary way that Black people describe themselves and that they were described in the census, you know.
Blake's topic, a good film, I thought. A lot of questions. Some answers, a lot to think for myself. We have a recording. If some of these things are too fast for you, I will have a look on this recording. We're going to put it on our YouTube channel in a few days. So we can work on that. And thanks again for coming. And I recommend the exhibition once again. There are some links between what we talked about and what you're going to see over there. So thanks for being with us tonight, and come back to the Goethe-Institut.